We do want to get to some breaking news right now from the New York Times. The reporting right now that Mueller witnesses who once served in the White House now fear Trump's ire. Joining me now by phone is New York Times Washington correspondent Michael Schmidt, who wrote that story. And Michael is also an MSNBC national security contributor. And Michael, you've learned that that the president has not even looked at the Mueller report yet?
Well, he has not read the report. He has been briefed on it, and he's being told about it by his advisors. And he's particularly bothered by the statements in the report from Don McGahn, his former White House counsel, who laid out in detail to the special counsel's office different instances in which the president tried to impede the investigation. Now, Don McGahn cooperated, we have to remember, with Mueller's investigation because the president encouraged him to do that. McGahn was told to go and meet with the special counsel's office. The president and his lawyers were trying to hasten the end of the investigation by cooperating. They thought they could bring an end to it. But the president doesn't like some of the things he sees in his report. And we saw some of this begin to bubble up yesterday with the president's lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, going after McGahn and saying that his recollection of some important episodes in the report were not accurate.
And Michael, you're also learning more about the growing tension between the White House, the president, and former White House counsel Don McGahn, as you mentioned. But I also took note from reading the report that the president is not too happy about Rob Porter's former staff secretary as well.
Well, the thing about the report is that there are account after account from the people closest to the president, the people who were seen as the most loyal to him, giving up details, some of them embarrassing, some of them potentially demonstrating obstruction of justice, that don't look great. This document doesn't look great, the president realizes, and he realizes that he may have a political problem on his hands, and he does not like that, and he's lashing out, and Giuliani, in response, is beginning to sort of beat the drum against the report. So instead of taking a victory lap and saying, oh, great, the Attorney General has cleared the president of any wrongdoing, what's gone on is that they are now going after different parts of the report.
And finally, who are the four witnesses that are fearing Trump the most?
Well, we don't say in the story who the four witnesses are or which witnesses are fearing the president the most. There's a general sense among the witnesses that the president, at the turn of a dime, could tweet something about these people and attack them. And many of them have built their post-government life around being Trump surrogates, Trump associates, and having the appearance of access to the president.
All right, Michael Schmidt of the New York Times, Washington correspondent there, with the very latest and the sort of fallout that is taking place after the Mueller report. Talk about fire and fury. Apparently, it is taking place behind the scenes.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.